The Valorian Empire had ruled the Andara cluster for 12,000 years. Their silver-skinned diplomats had brought peace to 47 different species. Their scientists had mapped the invisible highways between galaxies. Their cities floated among the stars like beautiful dreams made of crystal and light. They believed nothing could threaten them. They were wrong. High Counselor Veltan stood before the emergency assembly with exhaustion in his 3 eyes. The massive holographic displays behind him showed images that made the gathered counselors gasp in horror. Entire planets had been reduced to ash and dust. Defense fleets that had taken centuries to build were scattered like broken toys, and the enemy, the terrible devourer swarm, was still advancing with a hunger that could not be satisfied. The swarm was not like any enemy the Valorians had faced before. It was not an army or a fleet. It was a living thing that stretched across light years of space. Its ships were made of living tissue and metal fused together. They did not come to conquer or to negotiate. They came only to consume. Every world they touched became food for their endless hunger. Veltan spoke to the assembly with a heavy voice. He told them that they had contacted every allied species in the cluster. The Kethrani, who had been their partners for 3,000 years, had retreated beyond the outer rim and sealed their borders. The Morvashi had done the same. The collective races of the Andara Pact, the great alliance that the Valorians had built over millennia, had abandoned them one by one. A younger counselor named Siravan raised her hand from the back of the chamber. Her voice was uncertain, but she asked her question anyway. What about the humans? What about the species from the distant Sol system on the other side of the galaxy? Silence fell across the chamber like a heavy blanket. The humans were newcomers to galactic society. They had achieved faster-than-light travel only 2 centuries ago, which was nothing compared to the ancient civilizations of the Andara cluster. They were considered primitive by galactic standards. Their small territory was barely a footnote in stellar cartography. Most species in the galaxy had never even met a human in person. Another counselor laughed bitterly at the suggestion. He said the humans were too young and too few. He asked what they could possibly offer against a threat that had destroyed fleets 100 times larger than anything humanity possessed. He called it a waste of time to even consider asking them for help, but Veltan had studied the humans. In the long nights when sleep would not come, he had read their history files with growing fascination and unease. Here was a species that had never known true peace. They had spent their entire existence fighting. They fought each other over land and resources and ideas. They fought diseases that should have wiped them out. They fought the very planet they lived on. And somehow, through all of it, they survived. When they finally reached the stars, they did not find the peaceful galaxy they had hoped for. They found hostility and dismissal. Other species looked at them with contempt, calling them primitive and violent, but the humans did not give up. They built their ships in silence. They trained their soldiers in shadow. They prepared for a day they hoped would never come, but knew probably would. Veltan made his decision. He ordered the communications officer to send a transmission to human space. He told the assembly that they had nothing left to lose. If the humans refused to help, they would be no worse off than before. If they agreed, perhaps there was still hope. The transmission traveled across the vast emptiness of space. It passed through relay stations that had been built by civilizations now long dead. It crossed regions of the galaxy that no Valorian had ever visited. And finally, after 2 days, it reached the human colony at the edge of their territory. The response came 1 day later. It was brief and to the point, which the Valorians would soon learn was typical of human communication during times of crisis. The message came from a human admiral named Ben Carter, transmitted from a vessel called the USS Defiance. The message said only this: "Message received. We are coming. Hold your position." Siravan asked the communications officer how many ships they should expect. Perhaps the humans would send a token force, a few dozen vessels as a gesture of goodwill. Perhaps they would send nothing at all, and this was simply a polite way of refusing. The communications officer checked the telemetry data. Then he checked it again. His hands were shaking when he finally looked up at the council. He said that the humans were not sending a token force. They were not sending a small fleet, or a medium fleet, or even a large fleet. They were sending everything, every warship, every carrier, every destroyer and cruiser and battleship in human space. They were pulling vessels from colony defense forces, from research stations, from patrol routes. They were reactivating ships that had been retired to museums. They were calling veterans out of retirement and recruiting civilians to fill the gaps. The entire human military was mobilizing for a war on the other side of the galaxy. Veltan could not understand it. He asked the communications officer if there was some mistake. The humans had no treaty with the Valorians. They had no obligation to help. They were not even allied species in any formal sense. Why would they risk everything for strangers they had never met? The officer had no answer. None of the Valorians did. They could not comprehend a species that would empty its defenses, leave its homeworld vulnerable, and send its entire fleet across the galaxy simply because someone asked for help. But that was exactly what the humans were doing. Across human space, the call had gone out. Ships that had been scheduled for maintenance launched early with repair crews still aboard. Officers on leave canceled their vacations and reported for duty. Retired admirals and captains dusted off their uniforms and volunteered for service. Civilians with piloting experience showed up at recruitment centers and demanded to be assigned to ships. Something had awakened in humanity. Something old and deep and powerful. For 2 centuries, they had been dismissed by the galaxy as primitives. For 2 centuries, they had built their strength in silence, waiting for a chance to prove themselves. Now that chance had come. The Valorians did not know it yet, but they had just done something that would change the balance of power in the galaxy forever. They had asked humanity for help, and humanity had answered with the only response they knew how to give. All of them. Every ship, every soldier, every weapon. They were coming. Admiral Ben Carter stood on the bridge of the Defiance and watched the organized chaos unfold across 1,000 screens. He was 57 years old, with gray hair cropped short and eyes that had seen too many battles. His face showed the lines of a man who had spent his life making difficult decisions and living with the consequences. Behind him, his executive officer, Commander Kate Morgan, coordinated the incoming fleet reports with calm efficiency. She announced that the 3rd Fleet had assembled at the Mars staging point. The 5th Fleet was jumping from Titan. The 7th Fleet was en route from the Centauri colonies. Every hour brought new reports of ships joining the Armada. Carter asked about the reserves. Kate paused and scrolled through the data with something like wonder in her voice. She told him they were pulling ships from every sector. Colony defense forces had stripped their systems bare. Research vessels had mounted weapons and reported for combat duty. Even the museum ships from the Earth Heritage Foundation were being reactivated. The USS Ironclad had just reported ready for duty. Carter allowed himself a small smile when he heard that. The Ironclad was 200 years old. She had been the flagship of Admiral Nathan Cole during the First Interstellar War against the Krell Dominion. For the last century, she had floated in orbit around Earth as a museum, her halls filled with tourists instead of soldiers. Now her crew consisted entirely of volunteers. Veterans who had served decades ago came out of retirement the moment they heard the call. Men and women in their 60s and 70s pulled on uniforms they had not worn in years and reported to ships they had once commanded. They did not ask for payment. They did not ask for recognition. They simply showed up because they were needed. Similar stories were unfolding across the fleet. Captain Sam Reeves of the destroyer Vigilant had been a history teacher 3 days ago. He had taught students about the wars of the past and never expected to fight in one himself. When the call came, he walked out of his classroom and drove directly to the nearest military base. His students watched him go with confusion and admiration. Lieutenant Amy Porter had been in the middle of her medical residency at a hospital on Mars. She was 2 years away from becoming a fully licensed doctor. When she heard about the mobilization, she packed her surgical tools and volunteered as a field surgeon. The fleet would need doctors, she said. She could finish her residency after the war. Chief Engineer Dan Hawkins had retired 15 years ago after serving on 6 different ships during the border wars. He spent his days fishing on the lakes of New Oregon and trying to forget the sounds of battle. When the message reached him, he pulled his old uniform from storage. It still fit despite the years. He caught a transport to the nearest shipyard and requested assignment to the oldest ship they had. They gave him the Ironclad. The mobilization took 4 days. Ships gathered at staging points across human space. Supply convoys loaded ammunition, and medical supplies, and food. Technicians worked around the clock to repair damage and install upgrades. The entire human civilization bent itself toward a single purpose, with a focus that surprised even themselves. When the final tally came in, Kate Morgan read it aloud with quiet awe in her voice. 4,732 combat-capable vessels, 1,800 support ships, total crew complement of 6.3 million personnel. It was everything humanity had. Every warship capable of fighting, every transport capable of carrying supplies, every vessel that could mount a weapon or provide support. Carter understood what this meant. If they failed, Earth herself would be defenseless. Pirate fleets could raid human colonies without opposition. Old enemies might see an opportunity for revenge. The entire human civilization was gambling everything on a single mission to save strangers on the other side of the galaxy. He opened a fleet-wide communication channel. His voice reached every ship in the Armada, from the mighty battleships to the smallest patrol craft. 6 million people stopped what they were doing and listened. He told them that 200 years ago, humanity reached for the stars. They found them cold and empty, filled with species who thought humans were primitive and irrelevant and beneath notice. Other civilizations looked at humanity with contempt and predicted they would fade into obscurity within a few generations. But humanity did not fade. They built their fleet in silence. They trained in the shadows of their own solar system. They prepared for a day they hoped would never come, but knew probably would. Now that day had arrived. Carter told them about the Valorians. A civilization was dying. Their calls for help had been ignored by every other species in their region. They had reached across the galaxy to humanity as their last hope because there was no one else willing to answer. Some of the crew might wonder why they should answer, Carter said. Why should they risk everything for strangers? Why should they leave their homes and families defenseless to fight a war that was not their own? The answer was simple. Because they asked. Because somewhere in the darkness of space, someone was afraid and alone and crying out for help, and humanity could hear them. That was enough. That had always been enough. Carter told them they were the sons and daughters of warriors. They carried the legacy of every battle humanity had ever fought. From the ancient wars on Earth to the conflicts among the stars, the blood of soldiers flowed in their veins. Today they would show the galaxy what that legacy meant. He paused and looked at the faces of his bridge crew. He saw determination in their eyes. He saw fear as well, but it was the kind of fear that sharpened the mind rather than weakened it. These were people who understood what they were about to do and had chosen to do it anyway. Carter gave the order. All ships prepare for jump. The fleet moved as one. Engines that had been idle for years roared to life. Navigation systems locked onto coordinates that most human computers had never processed before. Quantum drives powered up and bent space around nearly 5,000 vessels. Then they were gone. The staging points around Mars and Titan and Centauri fell silent. Sol system, the birthplace of humanity, sat empty and vulnerable. Every warship, every soldier, every weapon had departed for a war on the other side of the galaxy. The journey through the quantum highways would take 3 days. 3 days of waiting in the strange space between normal reality. 3 days for soldiers to write letters to their families. 3 days for captains to review battle plans they knew would not survive contact with the enemy. 3 days for 6 million humans to contemplate what waited for them at the other end. They did not know what the swarm looked like. They did not know how it fought. They only knew that every fleet that had faced it before had been destroyed. But they went anyway. Because someone had asked for help, because that was who they were, because humanity had never learned how to say no when someone needed them. The stars blurred around the fleet as they traveled through the quantum highways. Ahead of them waited a battle that would determine the fate of civilizations. Behind them, Earth turned slowly in the darkness, vulnerable and alone, trusting that her children would return. The Valorians had expected a small force, perhaps 50 ships if the humans were being generous. Maybe 100 if they truly wanted to make an impression. What emerged from the quantum highways on the third day defied every calculation their strategists had made. Counselor Siraven stood at the observation deck of the command station and watched the sky fill with human vessels. They came in waves, each one larger than the last. First came the scouts, small, fast ships that spread out to secure the arrival zone. Then came the destroyers, moving in tight formations with their hulls bristling with weapons. Then the cruisers and the carriers, and finally the battleships, massive vessels the size of small moons that blocked out the stars behind them. Siraven tried to count them but lost track after the first 1,000. She whispered to herself that it was impossible. By the ancient stars, there were thousands of them. The humans had brought thousands of warships across the galaxy. The human flagship took position at the head of the formation. The Defiance was not the largest ship in the fleet, but there was something about the way it moved that commanded attention. Admiral Ben Carter's image appeared on the Valorian command screens. His face showed no emotion, only calm readiness. He addressed High Counselor Veltan with formal respect. He said that humanity had answered the call. He requested tactical data on the enemy positions and permission to engage. Veltan struggled to compose himself. He had spent days preparing for disappointment. He had expected the humans to send token forces or to refuse entirely. He had not prepared for this. He tried to explain to Carter that the swarm was unlike anything the humans had faced. Their fleets had failed. Their defenses had failed. Their greatest weapons had been swatted aside, like insects. The swarm could not be stopped. Carter's response was brief and direct. He said that Veltan had asked for help. He had not asked for miracles. The humans would worry about what could and could not be done. For now, he needed the tactical data. Over the following hours, human officers met with Valorian commanders in a series of briefings that fascinated both sides. Captain Lisa Grant of the carrier Retribution studied the tactical data with growing intensity. She asked questions that the Valorians had never considered. How did the swarm react to unexpected stimuli? What happened when their formations were disrupted? Had anyone ever tried to confuse them rather than simply overpower them? Lieutenant Commander Greg Santos analyzed the swarm movement patterns on his personal display. He was a young officer with a reputation for unconventional thinking. He noticed something that the Valorians had overlooked. The swarm coordination was perfect. Every unit acted in complete synchronization with every other unit. There were no delays, no confusion, no moments of uncertainty. They moved as one massive organism. Dr. Mary Huang was the chief science officer aboard the research vessel Insight. While the military officers studied tactics, she examined the captured swarm tissue samples with her team. What she found confirmed what Santos had suspected. The swarm was not just coordinated, it was a single mind, spread across millions of bodies. Every ship, every creature, every tendril of living metal was controlled by a central intelligence. She brought her findings to Admiral Carter with excitement in her voice. She told him that perfect coordination was both their greatest strength and their greatest weakness. The swarm reacted as one entity, which meant it could be predicted. It could be manipulated. If they could find a way to overload its decision-making processes, they might create openings that could be exploited. Carter considered this carefully. In human history, hive minds had always been portrayed as unstoppable. They overwhelmed enemies through sheer numbers and perfect coordination. No human force had ever faced such an enemy in real life. But that was exactly the point. Humans had never fought a hive mind. They had only fought each other. And humanity was the most unpredictable species in the galaxy. Every human made their own decisions. Every human thought their own thoughts. Put 6 million humans together, and you had 6 million different minds, each one capable of surprising the others. Carter opened a channel to his fleet commanders. He told them to forget everything they knew about conventional warfare. They were not going to fight the swarm like a normal enemy. They were going to fight it like they fought themselves. Commander Kate Morgan understood immediately. She called it chaos warfare. Carter nodded. He explained the new tactical doctrine. There would be no standard formations, no predictable patterns, No centralized command structure giving orders that the enemy could anticipate. Every ship captain would have autonomous authority to engage as they saw fit. They would coordinate when needed and scatter when it served their purpose. The Valorian officers listened with disbelief. This violated every principle of military organization. A fleet needed coordination. It needed structure. Without central command, ships would get in each other's way. Friendly fire would become inevitable. The entire force would dissolve into chaos. Carter told them that was exactly the point. The swarm had never faced chaos. It had never encountered an enemy that could not be predicted. Every species it had consumed had tried to match its coordination with their own. They had all failed because no one could match a hive mind at its own game. But humanity was not going to play that game. They were going to give the swarm nothing to coordinate against. Every human captain would make their own decisions. Every human crew would fight their own battle. The swarm would face not one enemy, but thousands of enemies, each one as stubborn and creative as any human who had ever lived. It was madness by galactic military standards. The Valorians watched the human officers discuss the plan with growing concern. These were not the actions of a professional military force. These were the actions of people who had decided to throw away the rulebook entirely. But as the hours passed and the final preparations were made, something began to change in the Valorian observers. They watched the human crews with new eyes. They saw the way individual soldiers moved with purpose and initiative. They saw captains making decisions without waiting for orders from above. They saw a fleet that operated not as a machine but as a living thing, each part thinking for itself while still working toward a common goal. Perhaps the humans were mad. Perhaps this strategy would fail catastrophically. But as the swarm drew closer to Andara Prime, the Valorians realized they had no other options left. They had called for help, and the humans had answered. Now they would have to trust that these strange, unpredictable creatures knew what they were doing. The final briefing ended, as reports came in that the swarm had entered the system. Admiral Carter dismissed his officers with simple words. He told them to trust their instincts. Fight smart. Come home alive. Then he returned to the bridge of the Defiance to wait for the battle that would determine the fate of civilizations. The swarm arrived at Andara Prime on the 7th day since the human fleet had departed Sol's system. It came as a wall of biological ships that stretched across the horizon of space and blotted out the stars behind it. The vessels were not made of metal like normal ships. They were grown from living tissue fused with technology that no species in the galaxy understood. Tendrils of dark matter connected them like the neurons of a vast brain. They moved with terrible grace, reaching toward the planet below with hunger that could not be satisfied. Conservative estimates from the Valorian sensors put their numbers at over 100,000 individual vessels. Some were small, no larger than human fighters. Others were massive, great leviathans of flesh and metal that dwarfed even the largest human battleships. All of them moved in perfect synchronization, guided by a single intelligence that controlled every action. Admiral Ben Carter watched them come from the bridge of the Defiance. Around him, his crew worked in focused silence. Every officer knew that the next few hours would determine whether civilizations lived or died. There was no time for speeches now. The talking was over. Carter gave the order. All ships execute Protocol Wildfire. The human fleet exploded into motion. But instead of forming battle lines, instead of presenting a unified front as every other species had done, they scattered. Thousands of ships broke formation and flew in every direction. Destroyers dove toward the swarm from unexpected angles. Cruisers looped around in spiraling patterns that made no tactical sense. Carriers launched clouds of fighter craft that dispersed into the darkness like seeds in the wind. The swarm hesitated. For a fraction of a second that felt like an eternity, the hive mind struggled to process what it was seeing. Every enemy it had faced before had organized itself into predictable patterns. Every species had tried to match coordination with coordination. This was something new. This was chaos. The human ships struck from every direction at once. There was no pattern to follow, no formation to counter. Every time the swarm moved to engage one group of human vessels, another group attacked from a different angle. Every time the hive mind adapted to a tactic, human captains invented new ones on the spot. Captain Sam Reeves led his destroyer group in a spiraling attack that drew swarm units away from the main formation. He watched the biological ships pursue him, their movements slow and confused as they tried to predict where he would go next. When enough of them had followed, he reversed course without warning and smashed through their weakened flank. His destroyers tore through the swarm vessels like wolves through a flock of sheep, then scattered before the hive mind could respond. Commander Amy Porter coordinated the medical ships from her position near the rear of the battle. These vessels were not designed for combat, but she found ways to make them useful. They darted through the chaos of battle, rescuing crews from damaged vessels and evacuating wounded soldiers. Between rescue runs, they laid minefields in the paths where swarm ships were likely to travel. The biological vessels blundered into these traps again and again, their perfect coordination unable to account for obstacles that appeared without pattern or warning. Chief Engineer Dan Hawkins served aboard the ancient ironclad, keeping the old battleship fighting through damage that would have crippled a modern vessel. When her main weapons failed, he rerouted power through systems that had been obsolete for a century. He created improvised energy bursts that confused swarm sensors and made the ship appear to be in multiple places at once. The ironclad should have been destroyed in the first hour of battle. Instead, she kept fighting, held together by the skill and stubbornness of her veteran crew. On the carrier Retribution, Captain Lisa Grant launched wave after wave of fighter craft. Each squadron executed maneuvers that no central command had authorized. Each pilot fought with the creativity that came from a lifetime of human training. They did not wait for orders. They saw opportunities and they took them. They saw dangers and they avoided them. They fought as individuals within a greater whole, each one making decisions that the swarm could not predict. The Valorians watched from their command station with stunned silence. This was not warfare as they understood it. This was beautiful and terrible chaos. A storm of individual human will crashing against the swarm's perfect unity. Ships moved in patterns that seemed random but somehow achieved tactical objectives. Attacks came from directions that should have been impossible. The human fleet fought like a living thing that could not be predicted or controlled. Hours passed. The battle raged across the space around Andara Prime. The swarm pushed forward, absorbing losses that would have broken any normal fleet. For every tactic the humans invented, the hive mind eventually developed a counter. Slowly, inexorably, the biological fleet gained ground. Human ships began to fall. The Vigilant took heavy damage and limped away from the front lines. A dozen destroyers vanished in flashes of light. The ironclad lost half her crew to a direct hit that breached 3 decks. But the humans did not break. They did not retreat. They adapted and changed and found new ways to fight. The chaos never stopped. The unpredictability never faded. 6 million humans made 6 million decisions every second, and the swarm could not keep up. Then Admiral Carter played his final card. He opened a fleet-wide channel and gave a single order. All ships, execute convergence. The scattered human fleet suddenly reformed. Ships that had been fighting independently across the entire battlefield turned and aligned into a single massive wedge. Every vessel, from the mightiest battleship to the smallest patrol craft, formed into one coordinated formation, aimed directly at the heart of the swarm. The hive mind had spent hours adapting to chaos. It had learned to expect the unexpected from the human fleet. Now, the humans did the one thing the swarm could not anticipate. They became predictable. They became unified. They became exactly what the swarm had been waiting for. But the swarm had no template for this sudden shift. Its neural networks were configured for chaos. They could not process the change fast enough. For precious seconds, the hive mind froze, caught between 2 contradictory sets of predictions. In those seconds, the human fleet struck. Every weapon fired simultaneously. Every engine pushed to maximum power. The wedge drove into the swarm like a spear, cutting through the biological ships with focused fury. They aimed for the cluster of command organisms at the center of the formation, the great leviathans that coordinated the entire hive. The explosion was visible from the surface of Andara Prime. A second sun bloomed among the stars, brighter than anything the Valorians had ever seen. It burned for several seconds before fading to darkness. When the light cleared, The swarm was in complete disarray. The command organisms had been destroyed. Without their coordinating intelligence, the remaining biological ships lost all sense of purpose. They attacked each other in confusion. They fled in random directions. Some simply went dormant, floating in space like dead things. The human fleet, battered and bloodied, held the field. Ships that had taken terrible damage still flew their patrol patterns. Crews that had lost half their members still manned their stations. The humans had won. The swarm had been broken. Admiral Carter looked at the displays showing the remnants of the enemy fleet and allowed himself to breathe. Around him, his crew began to cheer. Across the fleet, similar celebrations erupted as the reality of their victory sank in. They had done the impossible. They had defeated an enemy that had consumed entire civilizations. They had answered a call for help from strangers across the galaxy, and they had won. But the cost had been terrible. Carter looked at the casualty reports beginning to come in and felt the weight of every name. This victory had been paid for in blood. It would be celebrated and mourned in equal measure. For now, though, there was only relief. The battle was over. Andara Prime was saved. And humanity had proven something that the galaxy would never forget. The aftermath of the Battle of Andara Prime would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for thousands of years. Scholars and strategists would analyze every maneuver and every decision. They would debate the tactics and argue about the turning points. But no amount of analysis could capture what it had truly meant to be there. To fight against impossible odds for people you had never met. Of the 4,700 vessels that had answered the Valorian call for help, 2,100 returned to Sol system. The rest were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Over 2 million humans had given their lives to save a civilization they had never known. Their names were recorded in memorial databases that would be preserved for as long as humanity existed. The Defiance did not return to Earth. Admiral Carter donated the flagship to the Valorian people as a permanent memorial. It was stationed in orbit around Andara Prime, where visitors from across the galaxy could walk its corridors and learn about the humans who had come to help. A wall was built in the main observation deck, and on this wall scrolled the names of every human who had fallen in the battle. Carter visited this wall every day during his final months of service. He stood before it for hours, reading the names as they scrolled past. He remembered faces he had known. He remembered stories he had heard. He remembered the last words of captains who had sacrificed their ships to protect others. Each name represented a person who had left their home and family to fight for strangers. Each name was a debt that could never be repaid. High Counselor Veltan found him there one evening, standing alone in the dim light of the observation deck. The Valorian approached slowly and stood beside the human admiral in respectful silence. Finally he spoke, admitting that humans continued to confuse him. Carter asked him to explain. Veltan said that his people had nothing to offer humanity. They had no treaty with humans. They had no obligation to help. They had not even been allied species in any formal sense before the battle. The humans had been safe in their corner of the galaxy. They could have ignored the call for help and continued their lives without consequence. Instead, they had sent everything they had and lost millions of their people. He could not understand why. Carter thought about the question for a long time before answering. He told Veltan that when humanity first reached the stars, they feared many things. They feared the void between worlds. They feared the alien species they might encounter. They feared the wars they might have to fight. But their greatest fear was something else entirely. Their greatest fear was irrelevance. They had journeyed across the cosmos and discovered that the universe was vast beyond imagination. Civilizations had risen and fallen for millions of years before humans even existed. Species had built empires that spanned galaxies while humanity was still learning to make fire. In the face of such history, humans felt small and insignificant. They worried that they did not matter. They worried that the universe would continue without them and never notice their absence. Carter told Veltan that the Valorians had given humanity something precious. They had given them purpose. By asking for help, they had proven that humanity mattered. They had shown that even a young species from a distant corner of the galaxy could make a difference. How could humanity not answer such a call? How could they refuse when someone finally needed them? Veltan did not fully understand, but he accepted the explanation with gratitude. Perhaps someday his people would comprehend the humans better. For now, it was enough to know that they had chosen to stand with the Valorians when no one else would. In the years that followed, humanity's role in galactic society transformed completely. They were no longer the primitive newcomers that other species dismissed with contempt. They were no longer a curiosity or a footnote in stellar cartography. They became the species that answered when others called. They became the fleet that appeared when all hope seemed lost. Human vessels began patrolling the major trade routes, protecting merchant ships from raiders and pirates. Human engineers traveled to Valorian colonies and helped rebuild cities that had been damaged in the war. Human doctors established medical stations on a dozen worlds, treating species they had never encountered before. Human soldiers trained with allied forces, teaching them the art of chaos warfare that had defeated the swarm. The galaxy began to change. Species that had ignored each other for millennia started working together. The threat of the swarm had reminded everyone that the universe was dangerous and that survival required cooperation. And at the center of this new cooperation were the humans, serving as mediators and protectors and friends. Captain Sam Reeves returned to teaching after the war, but his lessons were different now. He told his students about the friends he had made among the Valorians. He told them about the beauty of alien worlds and the strange customs of species they would someday meet. He taught them that the galaxy was not just a place of danger but also a place of wonder and possibility. Lieutenant Amy Porter finished her medical residency and became one of the first human doctors to specialize in xenomedicine. She developed treatments for diseases that affected multiple species and trained a generation of healers who would serve across the galaxy. Her clinic on Andara Prime treated patients from 30 different worlds. Chief Engineer Dan Hawkins retired again after the war, but this time he did not go back to fishing. He became a consultant for the Valorian shipyards, helping them incorporate human engineering techniques into their own vessels. The old veteran spent his final years teaching young Valorian engineers the secrets he had learned over a lifetime of keeping ships flying against impossible odds. Commander Kate Morgan was promoted to admiral after Carter's retirement. She became the first human to address the newly formed Galactic Defense Council, a body that included representatives from 60 different species. Many of those species had been saved by human intervention in the years since the battle. She stood before them and spoke about humanity's journey. She told them that 2 centuries ago, humans had been alone. They had built ships that no one asked for. They had trained for wars that no one expected. They had prepared for a day they hoped would never come but knew probably would. They had been right, and they would be ready for the next time. She told the council that humans did not seek glory or conquest. They did not expect gratitude or reward. They answered calls for help because that was who they were. They were the fleet, written in legends, and they would never stop answering the call. The chamber erupted in applause. Representatives from species that had once dismissed humanity now rose to their feet in respect. The sound echoed across the vast hall, a symphony of appreciation from beings who had learned that the young species from Sol System was anything but primitive. Outside the council chamber, through the transparent walls, human ships patrolled alongside vessels from a dozen different civilizations. They flew in formations that mixed chaos and coordination in ways that had become distinctly human. Their hulls carried the names of ships that had fought at Andara Prime: Defiance, Ironclad, Vigilant, Retribution. Each name was a promise to those who had fought before. Each name was a reminder of what humanity had proven. The swarm had been destroyed, but the humans knew that other threats would come. The universe was vast and dark, and full of dangers that no species could face alone. But they were not alone anymore. They had allies now. They had friends. They had earned their place among the stars. And somewhere in the vast darkness between galaxies, other species looked toward the region of space where human territory began. They saw the patrol ships, with their strange names and their unpredictable movements. They saw the fleets that gathered when someone needed protection. They saw a civilization that had traveled across the cosmos to help strangers and had paid for that help with millions of lives. And they felt something they had never felt before when looking at the humans. They felt hope,